also. So this morning we are in Joshua chapter 5, so you can open up there to Joshua chapter 5. And the title of our series, the entire series, is Into the Promise, because this book, Joshua, is actually not about Joshua. He seems to be the main character, however, he's not the main character. Joshua's the leader. He's leading the people into something called the Promised Land. This is something that God had promised them, or a land that God had promised them. And so Joshua's the new leader. He took over from Moses. And but he's leading them into the promise of God. And really the main character in this book and in every book of the Bible, all 66 books of the Bible, is always going to be God. What is God doing? How is God working in his people? How is he working through Joshua? That's what we're seeing, is that account of how God is using Joshua to lead the people, and so all that he's doing. And God is always working in so many different ways, all at once. And so that's what we're looking at here in the book of Joshua. We come to chapter 5, and they have actually crossed over into the Promised Land, and they're camping at a place called Gilgal, and they're waiting. They're about to go and attack a city called Jericho. And so we'll get to that soon enough, but not today, actually, because they are not ready to go to Jericho quite yet. And that's what today is all about. It's about preparation, preparing for warfare, preparation for warfare. For those of you that take notes, it's got quite a few main divisions here. There's a lot going on. We see in verse, did somebody just not? Somebody just not? Yeah, there they are. Verse 1, we see that there's a group of people that are spiritless. We'll talk about what all that means. We'll see a second circumcision, ouch, celebrating the Passover, ceasing of the manna. We'll talk about what that is. And then a surprise visitor at the end, verses 13 through 15. This is preparing for warfare. Let me read something to you here from Ephesians 6:12, and you can see it on the screen in front of you. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That is in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. On Wednesday nights we're in Ephesians, and we're in chapter 5. So eventually we'll get to the sixth chapter probably in another year or so. But we'll get to look at this a little bit closer. But I'm going to sum it up for you real quickly what Paul was talking about here. What Paul was pointing out was that when we fight, we're not fighting against flesh and blood people. We're not. Our battle isn't, with my principalities. But it's not against my brother or my sister or my, this person that used to be my friend, and that's my fight. I'm fighting them in the flesh. What Paul was pointing out is that we have spiritual battles that we wage war. We fight in a spiritual realm. Now, if it's a spiritual fight, then that means that the preparation is going to be different. If I am a boxer, if I am a martial artist, if I'm going into a fight, and I know that somebody wants to meet me in the alley after school or something, and they want to fight and, hash it all out, I know that I need to train a certain way. If you play football, you're going into a battle, crushing each other, and you know that you have to prepare for that in a certain way. Well, if we have a spiritual fight that we are fighting, it's spiritual warfare that we are primarily involved in, then the preparation is going to be different. You can do all the push-ups that you want, and push-ups are good for you, but they're not going to help you spiritually. You can lift a bunch of weights, you can take some boxing classes, you can take some judo classes, you can take, whatever kind of classes you want, but those are not going to help you in a spiritual battle. And what we're talking about today is a spiritual preparation for really what is a spiritual battle. And they will go in and they will physically battle with other armies. But God is making it clear here in chapter 5, as they're getting ready to go into the land and start to take over these cities, he's making it really clear that this is not a battle of flesh and blood. Yes, there are people that they are going to chase out of the land, but it is primarily a spiritual battle. And thus, they need to be prepared spiritually. Okay, and so we'll get into the first section here, which is just verse 1, and we will see that they are spiritless. But who is it that's spiritless? And what does spiritless mean? It means that there's no spirit. Let's look at this in verse 1. So it was, when all the kings of the Amorites, so the Amorites were one of the people groups inside of this land that they were going into. When all the kings of the Amorites, so notice there were multiple kings, okay, lots of different groups, who were on the west side of the Jordan, okay, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea. It gives us some geographical locations here for reference. As they crossed the river, the Jews were on the Israelites were on the east side of the river. They've now crossed over to the west side of the river. And thus we learn here the kings of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan. That's the Jordan River. So that means that they were on the west side of the Jordan, and now the Israelites have crossed over into their territory. And then there was a group called the Canaanites who were by the sea. So they were further west over by the coast. It says this, when they heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until we had crossed over, that their heart melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. And thus you see there where we get the title spiritless. They had lost their spirit. Now, what spirit did they lose? Did they have the Holy Spirit? No, they didn't have the Holy Spirit, but it means that any spirit in them, any fighting spirit that they had in them, was completely wiped out. Might be like going into playoffs, if you're on some sort of sports team, athletic team, going into playoffs, and you're feeling like, you know what, man, like our team is good, and then you find out that, you're seated with some team that's, they're like D1, man, and, I heard that the pitcher or their running back is, they're getting ready to go pro, right out of high school or something, and you hear about that, your heart melts, and your spirit just absolutely, dissipates. It's gone. You're destroyed. You're like, forget it. We're going to lose. And oftentimes teams can go into a game. They're already defeated before they ever even step foot on the field or the playing surface. Well, that's what happened here to these individuals. You have the Amorites, you have the Canaanites, and no doubt the others heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan. Now, in the event that you weren't here last week or last couple of weeks and you don't know, dried up the waters of the Jordan. What are you talking about? Well, God had miraculously stopped the Jordan River from flowing so that his people could cross on dry land and go into the promised land. And so these people, when they heard about this, they probably felt safe because, well, they're on the other side of the Jordan, and it's overflowing its banks, so there's no way they're going to be able to get across. And then all of a sudden, the next thing you know, goodness, they're across. They're in our land. When they heard that, it says that their heart melted. Their heart melted. And that's a great description of hearing something, when you're fearful. Our hearts melt. Well, this time it's happening to the enemies of God. Their heart melted, and it says that there was no spirit in them any longer. Again, that was any fighting spirit was gone. Any thought that they had that, maybe we can defend ourselves against these people, or, thank God for the river Jordan being, it's overflowing, whatever kind of spirit or whatever kind of hope they had was completely obliterated. It was gone. Their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. Now, it's important for me, I've got one subpoint for those of you that take notes, and that is that they had the fear of the Lord. However, do not be mistaken. We've heard that term lots of times, fear of the Lord, fear of the Lord, fear of the Lord. For us, it means that we have, yes, a fear. We understand that God is powerful and that he could, in fact, take our lives. He could take the life out of us. But more so, it means that we have a respect for God. That's what that fear of the Lord means, that I don't want to do anything that's going to displease him or dishonor him. This group of people, the Amorites, and that's not the Amaroites, okay, but the Amorites and the Canaanites, they had this fear of the Lord, but it was a genuine fear. They were scared. That's what that means. They were terrified. Now, I point that out because at the end of verse 1, it says, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. But understand, it wasn't just the children of Israel. I want you to think about this for a moment. The children of Israel, okay, they're crossing over, and it's possible that there were millions of them there. So it's a lot of people. So that's scary. But these are people who have been camping for the last 40 years. They do not have a city of their own with walls. They do not have trebuchets, catapults, to throw large stones at Jericho. They are walking up, they had some weapons, but they were handheld weapons, and they didn't have anything that was really of any real threat to a walled city like Jericho. And all of the cities in the new land are all walled. So there wasn't really any reason to fear these people. They're traveling with men, yes, warfare, men of warfare, but also women and children and old people. I mean, everybody's coming in. And so there's really no reason to fear these people. So it's not that the Amorites and the Canaanites were afraid of the children of Israel, but notice there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. And what that means is that because of what God was doing in and with and for the children of Israel. The children of Israel didn't split the river open on their own. It was God who did that. And so whatever they were hearing about the children of Israel, whatever stories they had heard in the past, and you might remember Rahab, if you were here a few weeks ago, we talked about Rahab, who said, yeah, we heard that, what all, God has done for you, and we're all terrified, she told them, the spies. But they're hearing about what God has done, all of these miracles that God is performing, and because of that, they are absolutely terrified. Absolutely terrified. In Acts chapter 2, let me show you something here in Acts chapter 2. This is when the church is just barely starting out. The Christian church is just barely starting out. Acts chapter 2. And the Holy Spirit came and just really, it filled all of these new Christians, these new believers. And there was power that came along with that Holy Spirit filling them. And they spoke in tongues, and all of these miracles were beginning to happen. And it says there near the end of Acts chapter 2, after all of this is taking place, it says, then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. The fear that was there, that came upon every soul, was not just the church and the Christians, but everybody else also that was hearing about all that God was doing through these, some of these guys were, fishermen. I mean, they were not educated people with, degrees and large corporations, that they were heads of. These were ordinary people. And yet God was working miraculously, and because people saw the proof of all of that, fear came upon every soul. Same idea. It wasn't the apostles. The apostles were just guys, just men. It wasn't the apostles, but what it was is that it was God working through the apostles. Let me show you another one here from Acts chapter 5, verse 11. This one happens, this is a little scarier. There's a couple, power couple, named Ananias and Sapphira. Fancy names. But Ananias and Sapphira, just to cut the story way short, they were part of this brand new church, this brand new Christian church. But they ended up lying to the Holy Spirit. And it was this real dramatic scene where they both lied. Ananias, he came in and he lied first, and Sapphira wasn't with him, his wife. And because he lied, he actually dropped dead. And they carried him out. And then Sapphira came a little bit later, and she was asked a question about what was going on, and she lied also, and she dropped dead. And so it was this tremendous warning to the Christian church, like, don't lie. It was real clear. Don't lie. Don't play with the Holy Spirit. Don't mess around like that. Don't lie to the Holy Spirit. And what happened was, after they saw Ananias and Sapphira die, then it says this in Acts chapter 5, verse 11, so great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things. Everybody, right? If somebody walked in here Sunday morning and said something, told a story or their version of a story, well, we were at the beach on Thursday, I just wanted to let you know we were at the beach, and so-and-so was there, and they stole my money, or whatever. They told a story, and then all of a sudden they just dropped dead. And then somebody else came in, and I said, hey, I heard you were at the beach on Thursday, or I was there. So I saw you at the beach on Thursday. Yeah, I was there. Okay, well, hey, listen, what is it true that such and such happened? And they said, oh, yeah, that really happened. And then they dropped dead. And we go, hey, they dropped dead because they were lying. What would happen to us? We would be terrified, right? We would be absolutely terrified. We would not want to come in here and lie. Well, that's what happened there. Great fear came upon all the church, but there was fear, but there was also respect for the Lord, realizing that, okay, God is not playing here. Okay, this is not good what these people had done. But then it came upon all who heard these things. And that's oftentimes what happens. As God is working in us and through us, other people will oftentimes have a respect and even sometimes a fear of us, but it's not really us, it's what the Lord is doing in us and doing through us. And so that's what happens here in our text here in Joshua chapter 5. They hear about this and they're absolutely terrified. Let's move on to our second main division. Let's get there. Second, circumcision. This is a sensitive subject. Verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives for yourself, and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. Now, as I have done lots of times before, many of you know what circumcision is. If you do not know what circumcision is, what I describe it this way. It is a very minor surgery that can only be performed on males, guys, because they have a part of their body that only guys have, okay? Now, it is babies that are born today, male children that are born today are probably, I don't know the statistics, but probably 99.999% of the time they are circumcised unless the parents really do not want them to be circumcised. And nowadays, it's actually a matter of cleanliness. And so there is a portion of what is called extra skin, we'll see it called here foreskin, that can be removed from the male body. And now here's the deal. This had actually, we're actually going to get an account of all of this and why are they doing this, and why is there a second circumcision, and what does that mean? Does that mean one person was circumcised twice? No. It means that it happened in the past with a group of men, and then it's going to happen here, as we're going to see. But we'll see here in verse 2 that this is actually commanded by the Lord. He commands him. He tells Joshua, make flint knives, which I understand, they're made out of a certain kind of stone. And what I found out in studying is that not only is flint, can it be, it's extremely sharp, but it's actually sterile also, which I did not know that. But make flint knives for yourself. He's telling Joshua this. And circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. So, as uncomfortable as this entire process would have been for the individual being circumcised, I think about Joshua. He's the one being told by the Lord, I want you to make flint knives and you do the circumcising. He's like, really? Me? I'm the leader. Can I get someone, can I appoint someone else to do this? But it seems that it was assigned to Joshua. Now, I love this. Let's move on. Verse 3. So Joshua made flint knives for himself. Seems that he made more than one. And circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins And no doubt it was called the Hill of the Foreskins after this event, because this must have been where it took place, obviously. But it was commanded by the Lord and carried out by Joshua. Now, I love this about Joshua. This gives us an opportunity for just a moment, and I've got to be careful because I really love this subject and I've got to keep moving. You're like, what, the circumcision subject? No. The servant leader subject. Joshua, it says in verse 3, made flint knives for himself. He was obedient to God. And he circumcised the sons of Israel. This could have been a very, awkward, uncomfortable position for him to be in. And no doubt it was awkward, would be my guess. But God had called him to do this. Now, this, in and of itself, is a strange thing for us. Because leaders, we often see leadership as the people who point at what needs to be done. Hey, you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this. But that's the model that we get in the world. That's the model that we get, that's part of the sinful world system. If you're in charge, if you're the boss, then you're supposed to just bark out commands and point and tell people where to go and boss them around. However, that is not the biblical model of leadership. The biblical model of leadership, what is the kind of leadership that is always exalted and promoted in the Bible, is what we call servant leadership. Servant first. Servant leadership. And that is a leader who serves. That's a leader who's a servant. And not just a servant to God. We see Joshua here as a servant to God. But the leader, he or she, serves the people that he or she is leading. That's what they do. And so sometimes some of you want to talk to me after church or outside of church. You go, hey, could I please come in for counseling, or could I call you, or whatever? And sometimes I'll have some of you apologize. I'm so sorry for taking up your time. That's what I'm doing here. My time is not my own. My time is yours. So if you need to talk to me, there's no need to say sorry, because I don't mean this to sound bad, but, and this is not the only reason I do it, but that's what I get paid for. That's why I get a paycheck and can pay for air conditioning at my home or put gas in my car. The church here, your parents are giving money and the church is paying me so that I can be available for you. That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. And I'm supposed to be serving, not just serving the Lord, but serving the Lord as I serve you. Helping you out, assisting you with whatever you might need. And I love this here that Joshua, there does not seem to be any kind of balking on Joshua's part. Balking meaning there's no hesitation. He says, yes, Lord, I could do that. And boom, he immediately sets about doing it. And as awkward as it might have been, or dirty job, because there would have been blood involved, and yet he does not hesitate. He doesn't back away from it. And I love this. What a wonderful picture of Joshua being a servant leader. Now, how did he learn to be a servant leader? He learned how to be a servant leader after watching Moses for 40 years. He's been traveling with Moses for 40 years, and Moses was a servant leader. And he watched his example. And he followed in his footsteps. Okay, whatever it is that you need, Lord, that's what I'll do. And he did it without hesitation, and I absolutely love this. He didn't say, oh, this is beneath me, I can't do this. This is gross, I'm going to get somebody else to do it. But instead, he does it himself. And that's what a leader should always do. A leader should always be willing to serve on his self or herself. He or she should always be willing to do that. And so you need to keep that in mind, because many of you will find yourselves in leadership positions, whether it's in school or on a team or in academics. Group leader when there's a group project in class, and or later on when you start to work, and you'll get into a job and you'll end up in a leadership position, supervisor or manager or whatever. You might own your own business. And you need to keep that in mind. That the type of leadership that God approves of, that is godly, that is biblical, is servant leadership. We've got to be willing to get down on our hands and knees and do whatever it is that needs to be done. Plunge a toilet, mop a floor, sweep, help somebody, whatever it might be. We need to be willing to do whatever it is that God is calling us to do. Now, you will see here that I said that it was carried out by Joshua, verse 3, but also verses 7, 8, and 9. So we go out of order for a minute, but just to read the account here, in verse 7, it says, Then Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place. What that means is Joshua was an old dude by now. And he knew the parents of these guys that are being circumcised. But all of their parents had died off. They had all died. And so now he's raised up this new generation in their place, for they were uncircumcised in verse 7 because they had not been circumcised on the way. Verse 8, so it was, when they had finished circumcising all the people, that they stayed in their places in the camp till they were healed. Any kind of surgery, and even minor surgery, was going to take some time to heal. Then the Lord said to Joshua, This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Egypt is gone. The book of Exodus, if you're ever to go back and study that, and we do have the videos for that. If you haven't studied Exodus and you want to go back, go to YouTube or even to our podcast, and you can find those videos of Exodus. But the Exodus is all about God getting his people out of Egypt. Taking them out of Egypt. And then, as you get into Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, it's all about God taking Egypt out of his people. Because it's hard, right? Like, you can take, you might say something like, you might move to another state. Some of you will no doubt end up moving to another state. And it might be like, oh, you can take the guy or the girl out of California, but you can't take California out of the guy or girl or whatever. Because you might go to another state and you're still living, the California lifestyle, and people are looking at you like, what are you doing? We're in Iowa in the middle of a cornfield. Why are you doing that or whatever? And you're like, oh, that's what we did in California. But, we oftentimes, think of that, but, it's here we're told in verse 9, God says, I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So I've taken Egypt. It's gone. It's in the past. This is wonderful news, is they're going into this new land, this new time in their life, to know that God says, okay, the past is gone. Isn't that wonderful news? The past is gone. Especially when you've had a sketchy past. Isn't that good? Like when mom or dad just say, hey, I forgive you. Forget about it. Let's just move on. I love doing that. I've got kids that are now older, and so there's not a lot of discipline going on anymore. But when they were younger, just being able to say, hey, here it is, and maybe they would get a lecture or a spanking or whatever, and then afterwards being able to say, okay, I love you, done, forgiven, let's move on, forget it. That's a good thing. I want that in my own life. I want for God to say, hey, you're forgiven now, let's move on. So he says, I have rolled away the reproach, the hatred, the embarrassment of Egypt. It's gone. And then at the end of verse 9, therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal. That's where they were at, which means rolling to this day, because God said, I rolled away the reproach. Now, just let me remind you, remember that this group is preparing for battle. Preparing for battle. Now, just so you know, if you're preparing for a fight, somebody says, you know what, I'm going to meet you on Tuesday, man, and we're going to fight after school. You probably, in preparation for that fight, just a suggestion, you probably do not want to have surgery. Any kind of surgery. Because any kind of surgery is going to weaken you, right? So you don't want to go, I'm going to have to fight for my life on Tuesday, but, I'd really like to go, have this minor surgery done finally or whatever. No, you might want to have surgery to get out of the fight. But you wouldn't want to say, in preparation for this, I'm going to watch some fighting videos on YouTube, and I'm also going to have surgery, on my big toe or something like that. You wouldn't want to do that. That's not, if you're getting ready to go into battle, that's not something that you want to do. And yet, look what they've done. They're preparing for battle, and God commands that they all the fighting men, I mean all the men, but all the fighting men had to have surgery. And now they're in Gilgal camping out, waiting to heal. Now, if the people of the land knew this, they might have come and attacked them. But do you think that God is worried about the people of the land? No. He's focused on preparing his people right now. Now, we go, remember I told you we're a little bit out of order. Look at verses 4, 5, and 6. Let's look at the cause for the command. Why command these people to be circumcised? Verse 4. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt 40 years before, okay, who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people who were men of war, who came out of Egypt, were consumed, or they died, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. That's another story for another time, but they disobeyed God, and so all of that older generation died off. And then it goes on to say in verse 6, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land, which the Lord had sworn to their fathers, that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's how it was described. What is all this about? Let me show you something. It's quite a bit here, but I'm going to put it on the screen. This is from Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 through 14, when God was talking to a man named Abram. He got his name changed to Abraham later on by God. But here's what God says to Abram. This is my covenant, or my agreement, with which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. The descendants of Abram were all of these people in Joshua. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. So that's what this was about. Why even have the surgery in the first place? Well, God commanded it because it was going to be an outward sign of the agreement or the covenant that God had with his people. It goes on to say, he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Ingenious. Because it's 8 days, a newborn baby, the blood is not coagulating yet. And it's not until the 7th or 8th day that the blood thickens and coagulates. So if you cut the skin prior to that, the baby's going to bleed out, bleed to death. Nowadays, they immediately give your baby a shot, you ladies, and even you guys, you'll be in the delivery room for many of you. But they'll take your baby, cut the umbilical cord, take the baby over, immediately start giving your baby shots, and then they will circumcise if you have a son, unless you tell them not to. And so they give this shot, and it immediately causes the blood to coagulate or thicken, so the baby doesn't bleed to death, obviously. But here, he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with money, isn't that a slave? We'll talk about that later. From any foreigner who is not your descendant, he who was born in your house, and he who was bought with your money must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. So it's going to be an everlasting sign. And the uncircumcised male child who was not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. But there was a simple fix for that. Be circumcised, and then you are welcomed in. And so it was going to be this outward sign. But something happens with that outward sign, that circumcision. It has a double meaning. It has a secondary meaning, which actually becomes more prominent. Here's what Deuteronomy 10:16 says, therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart. So he uses that act of circumcision and applies it not to the male body, but really it ends up being applied to men and women and to their heart. Therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be stiff-necked no longer. No longer. Paul puts it this way for you and I in Colossians 2:11. So Paul, that gets carried right on into the New Testament. And in Colossians 2:11, Paul says, in him, that's in Jesus, you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands. Made without, what does that mean? He's talking about a spiritual circumcision. By putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. In other words, what Paul is telling the Colossians is that this whole circumcision thing, yes, it was an outward sign for the Israelites. It indicated that they had a covenant and agreement with God. Okay, it was a big deal. And by the way, the Israelites were not the first ones to circumcise. There were people practicing it before the Israelites, but God took that and used it for his own purposes. But as it gets carried on a little bit further, we saw in Deuteronomy, and now a little bit clearer in Colossians chapter 2, verse 11, the idea is that guys and girls should be circumcised with the circumcision made without hands. That's a spiritual circumcision, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh. What is, I've got to put off my body? What does that mean? No, what he means is that we are no longer to live according to our own desires, our own, what the Bible calls flesh. In other words, what does my flesh desire? What do I feel like doing? Do I feel like looking at some video that I shouldn't be looking at? Or do I feel like ingesting some sort of drugs or alcohol, things that I ought not be doing? Do I feel like lying to this individual to try and save myself from some trouble? Those are all acts of the flesh. Those are all things that the flesh does. And what Paul is saying is, you need to show that you've been circumcised in your heart, spiritually, guys and girls, by putting off those things, not living like that anymore. So when somebody disses me, I am supposed to respond by sticking up for myself and letting them know, like, man, you don't talk to me like that, or you don't say those things about me, and you don't tell my friends this or that or whatever, and whatever. I'm supposed to go on and defend myself. And what Paul is saying is, there's no need for all of that, man. We're not fighting a flesh and blood battle. We're fighting a spiritual battle, and we've got to, you've already been circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, so you got to stop acting like you haven't been circumcised. Put off the body of the sins of the flesh. Stop doing what it is that you feel like doing. I know all the Disney movies tell you to follow your heart. Do what you feel like doing. And, whatever, it's fine for an animated movie, cartoon, or whatever, but you and I know the difference, right? Like, I'm not just going to do what I feel like doing, because what I feel like doing is not always good. Because sometimes you feel like punching your little brother in the face. But we've put off the sins of the flesh. You and I have been circumcised in heart, and we don't do that anymore, right? No. Now we respond to our bratty brother with love. You go, what? I know, that's what I'm talking about. Drastic. Cutting off, circumcised, right? Cutting off the sins of the flesh. That spiritually, that foreskin, cutting off that extra skin. Like, I don't need that. That's gone. So I'm no longer responding that way. Somebody treats me bad. Jesus said, turn the other cheek. He didn't mean turn their cheek. He meant turn your own cheek, right? So that's the idea here. So this started way back in the Old Testament when God had his people, when he commanded them to be circumcised. He did that for that primary purpose, but then there was also going to spiritual secondary service, which again, really changes. It becomes the primary reason for that circumcision, because it shows that it's a picture for us that, oh, that's right, I've cut off that old life. Done with all of that. Now, in verse 10, we move on to our third main division, which is celebrating the Passover. Verse 10 is just one verse. Now, the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. Now, we don't need to be concerned right now with the day, the 14th day of the month, that twilight. That is important, but what we really want to focus on is the Passover. And this is a great opportunity because some of you weren't here with us when we were going through Exodus and all of those books, and you're not really sure, like, you weren't really sure, like, what's the deal with circumcision? But now you're going with the Passover, like, what is all that? Well, I'm going to give you a short description of what it is. Look at this in Exodus 12, verses 25 through 27. This is what God told his people back in Exodus. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you. Wait a minute. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you. That's the land that they're in now, that we're reading about. Just as he promised, so he promised, and he kept his promise. They're in the land now. That you shall keep this service. What service? This Passover service. And it shall be, in verse 26, when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? Now, there was a reason, there was meaning behind everything in the Passover meal. It was a special meal. But we find out that they're supposed to keep it when they get to the new land, to the promised land. But I love this. Let me say something here. Verse 26, a quick side note. And it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? So this Passover meal was also supposed to be used as a teaching opportunity for the little kids. The little kids who were going to ask, why are we doing this? Why did we take in a lamb and keep it for several days and then end up killing it, Mom and Dad? Why did we do that? But let me share something with you. Whoever wants to be wise when they are older should ask lots of questions when they are younger. Whoever wants to be wise when they are older should ask lots of questions when they are younger. Ask your parents questions. Hey, Mom, Dad. Maybe they've been Christian all your life. Maybe you just grown up in a Christian home. Maybe you got saved just in the womb. Ask your parents, hey, what was your life like? Like, when did you get saved? You might be surprised. You might be surprised that your parents are crazy. You might find out some things about your parents. And not that they'll want to glorify their old life, but it might be that they didn't grow up in a Christian home, and maybe they got saved at some point in their life, and maybe you've never asked them about that, and you need to ask them about that. When did you get saved? Oh, how did you get saved? Wait, what happened? And who did what? Or ask them, hey, Mom, Dad, why do we go to church all the time? Why is church so important? Why do we go on Sundays? Why do we go Sundays and Wednesdays? Like, what's the big deal? Or why do we read our Bibles? You need to ask them those questions. Because one day you're going to have kids, and you're going to need to be able to explain to them. But it's a wonderful opportunity for your parents, just like these people, to teach and to say, hey, let me tell you about what God did. And you'd be amazed at what God has done in their lives. And my wife and I were just talking, I think it was yesterday, maybe it was the day before, but we were talking about what life was like years ago when we first moved into our house that we're in. And it was in the middle of August, super hot. And it was a previously government-owned home, because we're kind of ghetto. But we moved into this home, and there were things lots of stuff that needed to be fixed, but we didn't have air conditioning. So we went to Walmart, bought some fans, and got the fans going. And, I had grown up with a swamp cooler. Some of you know what a swamp cooler is. Anybody know what a swamp cooler is? Amen. Look at those are godly people right there. Yes, swamp coolers. I grew up with a swamp cooler. We never had central AC, we didn't have AC. And so we got into this house, but the AC was all broken down. The house had some problems, issues. And we moved in, bought a bunch of fans, and that's just how we did it. And sometimes on the super hot days, because we have little kids, we would take off and hey, it's super hot, it's maybe my day off from work, and let's go to Chuck E. Cheese. Why Chuck E. Cheese? Because the kids could play all day long, endless sodas, and all-you-can-eat salad, baby. Come on. Right? Mom, Dad, I'm hungry. Eat salad. That's what we had for lunch. I know, eat some more. We're not leaving, Now I got AC at my house. Now I can't live without it. Now if the AC's not running all night, I'm waking up in the middle. I'm hot. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why persecutest thou me? Become such a baby, man. But ask your parents, hey, what was life like? You're going to find out, man, like what God did. What? Wow. Ask them. Those who want to be wise when they are older must ask lots of questions when they are younger. But here in Exodus chapter 12, it says in verse 27, this is what you're supposed to tell them, that you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshiped. And so this Passover that they were now celebrating in Gilgal was to remember what God had done in the past. Some of us don't like history. Oh, I hate history. Want to make sure that you know your history or you'll be doomed to repeat it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul said this in verses 7 and 8. Therefore, purge out the old leaven. He uses that from the Passover meal. They had to get rid of the leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. Anybody ever says to you, I don't know if you ever heard that phrase, you're just like a lump on a log. I know, but I'm a new lump. That you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. These are all terms that have to do with the Passover. For indeed, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Jesus was the lamb. I told you in the Passover, they had to take a lamb, and then they eventually had to kill it and eat it. Well, Jesus, spiritually speaking, is our Passover lamb, sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness. Get rid of that stuff, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Let me say one more thing before we leave this section. I love this in verse 10. They kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. Jericho, that was God's enemy. That was their enemy. And here they are in the land of Jericho at this place called Gilgal. But they can see Jericho. It's right there. And the Jerichoites can look out and see them like, hey, they're right there. And they're celebrating having this meal. It reminds me of Psalm 23, verse 5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. When you know that God is your shepherd, man, and you're trusting him and you're walking with him, you could be right in the midst of just turmoil and just all kinds of craziness happening, and yet you can be experiencing peace. God can prepare a table for you in the presence of your enemies even. And you'll just be like, hey, man, I'm not scared. I'm trusting the Lord. He's giving me peace. But in order to experience that the Lord preparing a table before you in the presence of your enemies, you got to know that he's your shepherd. You got to be trusting him. You got to be walking with him through the valley of the shadow of death in order to get up to the table of the presence of your enemies where God will prepare a table for you. See, Psalm 23, verse 5, there's 4 verses before that. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want, or I shall not be in need. Right? He makes me to lie still, and he leads me beside the still waters, makes me to lie still in green grass. And it's trusting, and then he leads me through the valley of the shadow of death. Right? I've got to know that he's my shepherd in order to experience that peace. Let's move on. Let's finish this up. We got to get you guys out of here. Verses 11 and 12, the ceasing of the manna. It says in verse 11, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. So something's happening here. This verse, in verse 11, this happens after the Passover. Okay? They ate of the produce of the land. It's good stuff. Okay? It's a good thing. We'll find out why in just a minute. Verse 12. Then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land. So we have after the Passover, then after the produce. Verse 12. And the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. There's huge things going on here. Manna was a soft, edible substance that God would rain down on the people every night, so that when they woke up in the morning, they would gather it and eat it. And evidently, God was still providing this manna. Well, once they get into the land, they're now eating the produce of the land, so God does not need to send down that heavenly substance. It's time to give that up, and it's time to start living life in the new land. This indicates change. And many of us are content to just stay right where we're at right now with the Lord. Just, there's not really any growth in my life. I'm not really going backward, but I'm just kind of there. We get lethargic. Sometimes we get bored with the Lord. But it is God's desire to always lead us on to new things, to greater things. And there's always a time to leave the old stuff behind. Not bad stuff necessarily, but to leave the old things behind. We're coming up on the big switch, where we got junior hires, they're coming in as freshmen now. There might be some in here today because we normally get some that start to come in. Some people they're just eager, man. They're like, no, I got to get to the high school room. Can I come in? You may not know this, but we've actually had a couple of freshmen that have been here for the better part of this school year. They've been coming in. They came and Pastor Chris, is it okay if I come in here? Yeah, come on in. And they're coming in and they're hearing the Bible studies or whatever. It's just a time of growth for them. There are others that are going to be digging their heels in, right? I know none of you were digging your heels in when it was time to switch over, right? You were so eager to come in here. You're like, no, I was so scared of you, Pastor Chris, or scared of the high school or whatever. But there's always more that God wants to lead us into. And we want to be willing to do that, to even say, you know what, I gotta leave good things, the manna. I got to leave the good things, but they're the old things behind. And I got to move on and trust the Lord. So this was after the Passover and after the produce. And then finally, our fifth main division, and this is where we finish in verses 13 through 15. Verse 13 begins with a question. This is the surprise visitor, and I love Joshua here. And it came to pass, it's going to tell us a lot about Joshua. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho. So evidently Joshua was out walking. What he was doing, we do not know. A lot of people think he was planning his attack on Jericho. Doesn't say. It just said that he was out by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood beside him with his sword drawn in his hand. That's scary. I don't know if he was, it seems to us that he was by himself. He's out there walking around looking at Jericho, and then the next thing you know, there's somebody standing next to him. And this is not somebody just standing next to him. This is somebody with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him. Tells you about Joshua. No fear. He went to this guy and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? Who are you with? I think Joshua, I'm assuming he had his sword with him, but that's just my assumption. My assumption is that Joshua was going to find out, who are you for? You from the west side? On the east side, who are you for? And then he gets the answer in verses 14 and 15. So he said, this is the guy, no. It's like, wait, you didn't answer my question. Are you for us or for our adversaries? He just says no. He's like, this guy's like, no, I'm not for either one of you. No. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped, and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? I love this, man, Joshua. Servant leadership. When he realizes that he's in the presence of this angelic being, and many good Bible teachers believe that this was actually what we call a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. In other words, before Jesus was born through Mary, in the New Testament, that this was actually Jesus. I happen to agree with them. I like that thought, although it doesn't say that it was Jesus or the Son of God, but it does say here that he's the commander of the army of the Lord. I have now come. So Joshua falls on his face to the earth and worships, and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? I'm your servant. Tell me what to do. Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. Preparation for battle. For you and I as Christians, preparing for warfare starts with worship. For you and I as Christians, preparing for battle starts with bowing. Because we do not fight flesh and blood, but we fight from our knees in prayer, trusting the Lord, worshiping Him. We are going to see the people go and conquer Jericho. But they could not go and conquer Jericho if their hearts and the heart of their leader was not conquered first by the Lord. And here it is plain to see that Joshua immediately knows his place, bows himself, and he worships this commander of the army of the Lord, who, by the way, did not reject Joshua's worship. Oftentimes when there's an angelic visit, the angel will say, hey, get up. Don't worship me. I'm not the Lord. However, this commander of the Lord, this angelic being, did not do that, did not reject the worship. For you and I, preparation for warfare always must start with worship. If I'm facing some trouble, some hardship, some difficulty, if trouble is stirring, I want to find my first response to be worship, to be trusting the Lord, because that's going to get my mind and my heart in the right place. You must understand that the things that you and I face in this life, and it's hard, that those things are always allowed by the Lord and used by the Lord for the perfecting of our souls. And I don't want to miss that. I always want to know, I always want all that God has for me. I want all the growth that God, wants me to grow. Through the hardships, I need that. But in order to have that mindset, I've got to make sure that I'm bowing myself before the Lord, bowing before the battle. I've got to be in that position. So, Father, thank you so much for this morning.